There are a lot of pressing issues on the table at the Liberal National Convention taking place in Halifax right now. Supporters want to see action when it comes to solving the opioid crisis, access to free medicine, and decriminalizing the purchase of sex. A group called the Young Liberals say the current laws around sex work put in place by the Conservative government are increasingly putting people at risk. For more on this, I'm joined by Sarah Galashan in Vancouver. Sarah.
Carole, to understand the debate about the current laws, we have to understand how they kind of came about. And so we've got to take you back to 2014 when the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that there were certain provisions within the criminal code that were unconstitutional, that violated the rights of sex workers. And so the courts gave the Conservative government at the time about a year in order to make things right. And that brought about Bill C-36. Now, Bill C-36 did pass December of 2014. And in fact, there was actually a rare summer session in Parliament in order to make sure there'd be enough time for debate. And what this bill intended to do was address the concerns of the court. It also, though, introduced a number of new offenses. I want to go through with you what is currently illegal in Canada. If we can put up the board. It is, for starters, illegal to pay for sex or to publicly communicate an intention to do so. So that would mean no meeting in a public place, no car windows to discuss a proposition. It's also ads that were once placed. You'd find them in the back of newspapers and a flyer, publishing them. That's an offense. As well, receiving financial or material benefit from someone's sexual services is not allowed. That one, the wording's a little tricky, but basically you're talking about no pimping, no brothels. But Carole, the point is also made by some that there are concerns that would also mean you can't pay someone who would be in the role of protecting a sex worker. Okay, but selling sex is legal. Right, so that's the thing. And so how does it work, or does it? And the critics would argue, the critics would argue that it doesn't, and that was in fact the aim of the Conservative government. Certainly it does make things tricky, as I say. So here's what is allowed. Let's put up that board. As you say, selling sexual services, that is something that is legal. Conducting prostitution indoors is also legal, but not in a building or in an institution that's actually been set up for the purpose. So no brothels are allowed. Also, you can privately communicate that you are available to perform sex services. So that might, you might imagine then a scenario where you have somebody who is independently pursuing this in their own home. And although, of course, payment is still problematic for the customer, who stands to spend up to 5 years in jail and face cash fines for paying for sex, because, as we say, that is illegal. The Young Liberals who are bringing this forward at this convention, they are saying that these current laws that are facing those sex workers are actually driving prostitution underground. And it means that they are less visible to police and to others who might help them otherwise, Carole. All right, Sarah, thank you. You bet. So, should sex work in Canada be decriminalized? We have two people here with experience in the industry and very different points of view. In Toronto, Valerie Scott is a current sex worker and legal coordinator for Sex Professionals of Canada. And in Edmonton, Tricia Baptiste is a former prostitute who now works as a community engagement coordinator for EVE, Exploited Voices Now Educating, a group dedicated to the abolition of the sex industry. All right, Tricia, let me start with you. Should sex work be decriminalized?
Absolutely not. I don't understand why we want to institutionalize the worst of humanity. There's no reason that we should allow men to pay for sex. Men do not have an inherent right to dictate their orgasm on their terms at all times. And yet women who get involved in prostitution, it's their human rights that are being violated. They're usually there because of poverty, of colonialism, racism. There's a myriad of reasons that funnel women into prostitution. And so what we need to be doing is what our current laws are doing, which is to criminalize the demand for paid sex and to decriminalize the women who find themselves in prostitution and offer them a way out.
Okay. Valerie, what's your position on this? Should it be decriminalized?
Absolutely. It should be decriminalized across the board like they did in New Zealand in 2003. And from what we have seen in that country, lots of empirical evidence now, violence against us has absolutely decreased way through the floor. It's working out. Women can opt into pension plans, workers' compensation, They have to pay income tax, but at the same rate as any other small business person, not a vice tax or anything like that. As opposed to what we have in Canada, which is some sort of strange ideological viewpoint that all men who pay for sex are bad. And that is simply not true. There are tens of thousands of us who disagree with that point. And what PSEPA does, the Orwellian named and themed new laws, it is structural violence. We are terrified to go to the police. We're terrified because we are being under surveillance all the time. The police come to your door, they troll your ads. It's awful. People are afraid of losing their children. So we're forced way underground. Even neighbors who suspect that a sex worker is working will try and blackmail her. This is not helping women.
All right. So Tricia, what's your point to that? That it's
Again,
driving work underground.
I want to talk about the men. It was never the laws that beat and raped and killed me and my friends. It was men. It was never the location we were in that was unsafe. It was the man we were in that location with that made it unsafe. We know in New Zealand, human trafficking has increased there. We know New Zealand has problems with the decriminalization that's going on there. What we need to be dealing with is the root cause of all of this, and that's the demand for paid sex. Prostitution isn't...
Sex is not a bad thing. And what you're saying is like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, if you set it up so that it's a dangerous situation, if the government does that, and that is what these laws do, then of course you're dealing with people. And yes, predators will come out to play. We want them out. We want to be able to go to the police, but right now, no one in their right mind would ever think of doing such a thing.
Valerie,
I know women who have gone to the police. And I also just want to say, we allow people to drink and we allow people to drive. We don't allow people to combine those two because it hurts the common good. It's the same for sex. People can have sex all they want. I'm not anti-sex. But when you combine it with money, you create a system that that is rooted in inequality.
Not necessarily, no. I disagree. I never felt unequal. And I know many sex workers who do.
That's good for you as an individual. As an individual, that's great, which is why I don't think it's about arguing individual circumstances. Why do we think men should be able to pay for sex? How does that help create an egalitarian society?
I think all people should have access to paid sex, not just men, women. I think disabled people. It's not just sex, it's companionship as well. Sex work does a lot of good for the community. And I think these proposed resolutions that the Young Liberals of Canada have proposed, it's way beyond time. We know the harms that PSEPA has done. Empirical evidence is coming in. In 2017 alone, 11 sex workers were murdered in Canada that we know of.
And it wasn't the laws that murdered them, it was men that murdered them.
It was the setup. Look, if you make
Valerie, can I just jump in and ask you this to explain how you think if it's decriminalized, because you both agree that women in this industry are at risk of rape, beatings, murder. So how does decriminalizing, in your opinion, help prevent that?
Okay, in any other job, when there's something wrong, when people are at risk, we bring in measures and policies to help protect them. We don't push them further underground because we have an ideological problem with paid sex. Nurses, for example, they wear masks and gowns. They're exposed to disease every day. And, well, you try and make them as safe as possible. The same with taxi drivers, the same with police. The problem here is that this is because it is about sex. And people, sex
So
is...
the ways that you keep prostituted women safer are by putting a panic button in a room, are by taking pillows out of the bedroom because they can be suffocated with them. What kind of job is it where your greatest risk is being murdered and you're constantly vigilant about the violence that can be done to you in a moment's notice?
Well, I would say
we need to remember that Robert Picton's victims talked to him and decided to go back to his farm with him still. So it's not about interviewing a client and deciding whether or not they're safe.
It is exactly about allowing people human and labor rights. This is a labor issue. And that's what it's about.
It's an issue that's about
force
sexism,
it underground,
racism, colonialism, poverty. It's an issue about so many other things other than labor.
Okay, then why are you not talking about agricultural workers or domestic workers or construction workers? Because that's not about sex.
Because I'm on...
Because you have a problem
Let me
with
just
sex.
jump in here. Well, let me just jump in here and ask you, Valerie, how do you assess whether somebody is dangerous or not? What measures do you take to protect yourself?
I need to have their legal name. I need to have an email address and a phone number. I need to be able to verify them, that they are really who they are saying they are. I need to be able to have safe calls. I prefer working with other sex workers, but that's illegal now. And all of that together, I would like the police and the courts, if a predator is out there, I would like the police and the courts to take it seriously, unlike what they do now is just, sorry, so-and-so's gone missing. That's really not a priority for us. She's a sex worker. I'd like to see this done, this whole regulation, the way it is done in New Zealand.
Okay.
And it's not a free-for-all. There are 30 pages of laws and policies that must be adhered to.
Okay.
And it works very well.
Instructs women how to safely numb their vaginas so they can work longer. That's the kind of thing we're talking about.
The kind of thing we're talking about is safer sex practices, labor laws, and even sex workers' human rights are now entrenched into the Human Rights Code in New Zealand.
Tricia, let me just ask you before we go, because we're running out of time. You say it's about racism, you say it's about colonialism. What do you mean by that?
If you look at women in prostitution, and I work with women who are exiting prostitution all the time, there's certain factors they have in common. And whether it's poverty that drove them into it, whether it was they were at higher risk because of colonialism, they're at higher risk because they're in the foster care system, they're at higher risk because they have mental health, whatever it is that makes them more vulnerable and marginalized, it funnels them into prostitution. And we have to be honest, the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in prostitution will never see the safety of the indoor of a brothel were they to open.
Not so. In fact, in our case in the Supreme Court of Canada, there was a brothel set up in Vancouver around the time that women began. Around the time that women began going missing, called Grandma's House. Jamie Lee Hamilton set that up. The police closed it down, calling it a body house, and this was for street-based sex workers, people who were addicted to drugs, and it wasn't the Taj Mahal, but they could bring their clients there. It was safe,
well,
it was clean.
Maybe if you're addicted and you have mental health issues and you're there because of prior abuse, maybe we shouldn't be offering you up to men to purchase. Maybe we should be saying to those men, hands off her, let her heal, and have a chance to live.
On that, Tricia, I think we can agree that this job is not for everyone.
Let's leave it on that.
It's not a job, it's exploitation.
Let's leave it on that note. I want to thank you both very much. I think our audience was well served. We have an idea of where both sides of this argument lie. Valerie Scott, Tricia Baptiste, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, good night.